right, what's going on, everyone? Thanks for joining us for our KeyShot packaging design webinar. My name is Kareem Merchant. I'm an industrial designer and a creative specialist here at Luxion. And in today's webinar, we have the one and only Matt Hanzly, who you may remember from our KeyShot World 2021 presenters. Matt is an experienced packaging designer and visualizer who's been leveraging KeyShot in his projects for many years. He's worked at a few companies who I'm sure you are all familiar with. And today he's here to give everyone a closer look at his packaging design process. He's also going to cover some great info as to how he thinks about rendering and how KeyShot plays a role in his creative process. Before I hand it over to Matt, I wanted to put up some of our resources. If you have any questions about today's webinar and the KeyShot features that are discussed, feel free to reach out to myself at kareem@luxion.com or send questions and inquiries to our general info, our support and sales emails, which you can find on this slide, as well as on our website, www.keyshot.com. If you're interested in staying up to date with the latest news, releases, and events here at Luxion, you can find us through social on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And I also wanted to give a quick plug to our KeyShot 3D YouTube channel. Highly recommend checking it out. It's a great resource for KeyShot quick tips and tutorials for all our features, and we consistently update that with new content. We also typically post higher resolution versions of our webinars there a day or two after airing, so keep an eye out for those. And lastly, before I hand it over to Matt, I also wanted to plug Matt's Instagram. You can find him at Bucktail Design, where you'll find tons of his incredible work and you'll be able to follow his design journey. I'll be sure to link his account in the description below if any of you guys want to pop over there and give him a follow. And on that note, I will pass it over to Matt so he can dive into the world of packaging design.
Thank you, Kareem. Okay, for this webinar, I want to go over everything that's kind of involved in packaging, some of the stuff that you don't necessarily think about for rendering, but you have to think about in the design process for packaging. I'm also going to touch on what I do for rendering, how I set my stuff up. So your first goal when you design a package, it should be that your package has to protect the product. Your package needs to protect the product at all costs. If the product is broken, your package has failed. For this webinar, I want to break down everything that goes into your packaging design and go over some of the rendering techniques. Before you actually start designing your packaging, you need to understand some of the things about your product. Like, for example, the fragility of your product. Some products, your fragility, you have no worries. The product's always going to survive. If you're shipping weights, you're shipping something solid. It's never going to break. It's just you're just trying to get it there. Other things like a camera has a ton of fragility. You're trying to make sure those lenses stay perfect. So it's something you got to think about. Also, surface finishes. Some products you don't want it to touch the package, and there's other areas where it can touch the package, like I was saying, like screens or lenses. You want to avoid having contact with the package, so you avoid abrasions. The setup process, and by this I mean you buy a product, and there's especially consumer electronics, there's usually a setup involved for the customer as far as setting up that product to actually work. So what can you do for your package to try to make that setup process more intuitive? Then you also want to think about who's your target user. Is it a kid? Is it an adult? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it someone old, someone young? It's kind of just ways you want to develop your package around that. So once you kind of understand your ins and outs, it's also good to set up testing and figure out what a pass-fail criteria is for your packaging. Like, for example, some packaging I've had, if there's any damage to the package, it was considered a fail, even if the product survived. Then there's other packages I've had where it's as long as the product got there, it was considered a pass. So it's if you set that up with your client before you actually start designing, you're going to save a lot of time on the back end, because then you have a set rules that you're both playing with. So once you get ready to go, it's good to have a test standard set up. There's two main test standards, ISTA and ASTM. And these will usually include drop tests, a vibration test, an environmental test, and there's a bunch of other different tests. And these are meant to simulate what the package will see in the real world. Having these tests set up will help you compare your packaging so you have an even playing field. So that way you can look at, if you're doing a whole line, you can see how this product does compared to that product, and you're testing on the same platform. What I like to do a lot of times is I'll start out by over designing my packaging. For this, I mean, I'll make it my package so I know it's going to survive testing. I have no worries. I get it through testing once, and then you kind of work your way backwards. You start what can I take off of this? What can I shrink? What materials can I swap out? And you want to do this just to try to reduce costs. Because you don't, if you over package it, you're just kind of just throwing money out the window. Then you want to understand, like, how is your product going to be shipped? There's a couple different ways. Like, these are just some of them, but there's also a bunch of other ones. Like, is your product going to go on a pallet? Does it go direct to consumer? Is it a master pack? Or is it going to be like at-home delivery where the customer never touches the package? So it's like a completely different, where you're designing for a warehouse, or you're designing for a third party. And then this is just a render. I did some master packs, some shipping container or shipping packages. So for a pallet, if it's going to be shipped on a pallet, it's beneficial to understand like how many can fit on a pallet. There's a program called Tops, and there's also one called Cape, which they you put in your dimensions into it, and it'll determine the max number that you can fit on a pallet. And you want to do this because shipping containers, like right now, are incredibly expensive. So if you can cut corners on your pallets, you can save a ton of money that way. Sometimes like shaving a couple of millimeters off your package will save you huge money in transit. And then when pallet shipping, also your product usually goes in like a master pack, which is shown here, which is like a bigger box on the outside. And then on the inside, you'll have a bunch of like your products inside. The benefits of shipping on a pallet is, and shipping in the master pack, is your product actually doesn't really get hit with the damage. So like your master pack and your pallet's going to take a lot of the abrasion, a lot of the shock, where the internal parts still going to take some shock, but you're using that master pack and using that pallet to kind of brace for your packaging. And that way the customer never sees the damage. And then direct to consumer, you see this a lot more now, especially like with smaller companies will do this, where you just buy it off their website and they're shipping it from like their house, or they're shipping it from their warehouse, and they're just shipping it straight to you. So this is a little different, because then you want to, most of those packages are going to be shipped to FedEx, UPS, or US Postal Service. So it helps to go to those websites, because they'll have usually like a flat rate package. So you want to kind of know what sizes those are and where the price breaks are, so that way you can design up to that size and avoid adding extra cost to your packaging. So that way you know, if I add 2 millimeters, what's going to happen? Is my price going to go up, or is it still the same? Master packs, that's what I have shown here. Those are usually a RSC, which is a regular slotted container. And those usually have 4 flaps on top and 4 flaps on the bottom, and they kind of meet in the center. They're usually brown corrugate. And then inside of those, you'll have a bunch of primary packs. For some industries, they have rules on the amount of product they want inside those master packs. One such rule is called a 1.5 rule. And for this, it's a master pack, which would be inside it, you would have enough to fill a shelf, and then have half of a shelf still in the box. So that way they can put that master pack in the back room, so they have stuff to refill the shelf. Another thing you want to consider is some places will have like a POP, which is a point of purchase display. So like how many can fit in the point of purchase. So you want to figure out how many go in your master pack. It's probably going to be the same number, or you're going to do some multiple of that. But that's something you want to talk with your team beforehand, so you understand that. And this is an example of an RSC. This is an example of an RSC for KeyShot that I did that has the KeyShot package in it. This one has 6 in it. And then even before you start, you're still like haven't even started your design process. This is what you want to do next, is you want to start doing some research on what you want your package to do. So like what is expected in the market. So if you're doing consumer electronics and it's $1,000 item, you better have a nice package, because you don't, if you put it in a cheap package, people are going to think your product's cheap. And then also, like if you have a low-end product, there's no reason to put a super expensive package on it. So it's kind of, you got to kind of understand what's expected in the market, like what colors, what features are kind of already out there. It also helps to visit a couple stores and understand the retail environments. I find it helps too if you can talk to like a stock boy. They usually have a good idea of like what people are buying, and then what would help them. And then how is a customer going to move the product? This is really important for like direct to consumer stuff, because if you have a really heavy item, you want to understand like how is somebody going to carry this in their house? Is it going to be 1 person, 2 people? Just like how are they going to get through the door? How are they going to push it up the stairs, or how are they going to carry it? So you want to understand like where you're gonna put your handles, where you would put zip ties or tie downs or whatever you're gonna do to hold it shut. And then the next one is, this is getting really important with sustainability, is how are you going to dispose of your packaging? So you want to, ideally is you can make your package all one material, so that way it's single stream and you can just throw it all in your recycling bin. But if you have like plastic and paper, you want to have it so ideally so they're not glued together, so at least the customer can separate the parts and make it easier for recycling. And also you want to try to think about like, could you make this package so it folds flat? So that way it's easier to throw out, easier to recycle, and it like takes up less volume in their recycling bin. And then, like I was talking earlier, like what sort of setup is needed for the product? Is there wires involved? Is there a button they have to hit or something? What can you do for the packaging to like make that process more intuitive? What can you do to like call out what has to be done? So people, you can put instructions on there all the time, but a lot of times people just don't read. So it's like, what can you make the package work? How can you make the package work so people will understand how to set up the products? And then depending on what industry you're in, there's almost always some sort of legal information that has to go on the pack. For example, on like tobacco, there's always a ton of warnings. So like you might have to make your package artificially bigger than it actually needs to be just to fit those warnings, because you're going to have those warnings and then you're going to have room for branding. So it's good to understand like how much space you actually need for those warnings, what the minimum is. So that way you can kind of design off of that and then talk to your branding team and find out how much room they actually need. So then kind of have a baseline of what your package size is, what the minimum size has to be. And then also another thing to think about is documentation. This one I've done it before too, where you forget to include it, or you forget that it's gonna be that big. Where if you don't have, you have a quick start guide usually goes in there. You have a legal document. Sometimes you have stickers. And a lot of times those go in an envelope. So you have to like make sure you don't forget that stuff where you're not adding at the last step and then throwing everything off, because then it could affect your master pack, which then could affect your pallet quantity. So it kind of just snowballs. This is some of the stuff I before I started designing for the KeyShot package. Some of the stuff I thought about is like, what was the goal of my package? How did I want this to be printed? What type of materials did I want to use? And then what sort of programs was I going to use? This is kind of just the groundwork you use before you actually start designing. And this was also a render. Now you get into like the fun part where you're actually going to start designing. So now that you understand all the boundaries of your package, you can actually start designing. I like to start with hand sketches. So I'll try to do as many hand sketches as I can, and they don't have to be fancy because I'm not really showing them to anyone, maybe me or my team. And then from there, I want to kind of narrow it down and start refining them. And then from that point, I go into a program called Affinity Designer. Affinity is very similar to Illustrator. I just found it simple to learn and very intuitive for me. It felt like a CAD program, but I was drawing in it. I use Affinity to figure out what the unboxing process is going to be, what sort of materials I'm going to use, and then like the overall look and feel of the pack. I like using this program as it's a lot faster than CAD. I don't want to waste a lot of time building CAD that is never going to get used, or I have to go back and rework. Where this, you can get a pretty good looking package, a pretty good idea what your package is going to look like just from sketching. And then another tool I found has been important or helpful is it helps me understand proportions, where you can kind of lay out like on the KeyShot package, like what size I needed for that QR coin, and then how did I want that like framed in the package, and then what size did I want for the solid state drive that was behind it. So it kind of gives you an idea of what your proportions are going to be. And these are some of the initial sketches, initial drawings I did in Affinity, where they have like, what would the unboxing process be like? What type of boxes could we do? What could the QR code look like? And like, how could we remove the molded fiber tray that's holding the QR code? And then this is an example of like how I build my files in Affinity, where I build up in layers. You can get it pretty close to looking realistic. So this is I started with like a drawing, and then I added material on top of that, which I just used a polygon. I had a polygon metal material. I kind of added on top. I just drew in the reflections, and I added the QR code to kind of get it to look close enough to real. That way, when I was able to meet with KeyShot, I was able to show them this and this is kind of what it's going to look like at the end. So that way there was less surprise, where I'm not surprised at what's going to look like, and they're not surprised. So that way there's less back and forth, you hope, and there's less changes down the road. When it's harder, when you're in CAD, it's a lot more time consuming to go back and make all these changes over this. If they wanted to change the size of the QR code or the color, it's easy. And this is what I was talking about as far as proportions. I'll build like a top-down view like this, and I can kind of understand like how everything's going to fit and nest within each other. So it's just helpful that way when I go into CAD, I can kind of use this as like my drawing or my template to build off of. So I understand how everything's going to fit together. I understand the dimensions of everything. So I'm not designing in CAD. I'm designing in this and then just building in CAD. Also in that program, it's nice. Sometimes you get inspiration, like future render shots like come to you in your mind. Like this one, I knew I wanted to look at different foils for the cover. Like if you had KeyShot Pro, if you had KeyShot, like different versions of KeyShot, like how would you differentiate the packaging? So this was, if you looked at different types of foils. So I had drawn this in Affinity, and then down the road, I knew I wanted to do a shot like this, and I ended up doing a shot like this where they're all on the shelf, but then you see the different color foils all next to each other, and you kind of understand how this package is going to look on shelf. From this point, I'll start building CAD. And I use just like 4 main programs I use, which is SolidWorks, ArtiosCAD, Cinema, and Marvelous. You don't have to use these programs. You can use whatever you want, really. I think it's just whatever you get comfortable in. Try to get really good. Try to get really good at least one program, and then branch out from there. So that way you have like a base, and you can kind of build off of that. And it makes it a little bit easier once you have one program down to jump into another one. So I'm going to kind of explain how I use each of these programs and what features I like out of each of these. So for SolidWorks, I use SolidWorks to create 3D models that I know are going to be handed off to a supplier, and they need to be exact. What I mean by exact, like I know I can put it into SolidWorks, I can put in the exact dimensions, and I'm going to get, or I can put in the radius, and I know I'm going to get the exact radius, that exact draft. Everything's going to be exact. When I hand it off to the vendor, it's exactly how I want it. And some of the parts I'll do in this were the parts that aren't folded in packaging. So it'll be like your rigid box, your molded fiber trays, foam. I'll do my assemblies out of SolidWorks. I'll do thermoforms, and then I'll do injection molded parts. But this is just like how I do it. You don't have to do it this way, whatever you feel comfortable in. So when I say rigid boxes they're usually seen like high-end packaging. You can kind of think of, they consist of, there's like a chipboard, which is usually like a brown or a gray hard board, and then you wrap them in paper. That makes them very stiff, and they have like nice tight corners where they're nice, like a sharp 90 degrees. They're common in the consumer electronic business. And then they're wrapped in that paper, and that paper can be printed. And some of the nice things about that paper is you can also do embossing on it. You can add foil to it. It looks really nice. And there's some tricks you can do. You can hide stuff inside that chipboard. Like you can die cut inside of it and then put a magnet in there. So that way the customer never sees the magnet, but then you have like a magnetic closure. Other than that, kind of messes with your sustainability, because then you have metal injected into your paper. And then one trick I found for KeyShot is when you're building these rigid boxes, if you have like a box style or a book style rigid box, kind of like I did for the KeyShot package, it's helpful to add your pivot points in SolidWorks or in whatever CAD program, and then bring it into KeyShot, so that way you can pivot the lid open. Even if you're not going to do an animation, it's nice to have that lid animation built, so that way when you're doing your renders, you can just open and close that box without having to like grab a panel and move it. I'll just show you what I mean by that. So this is that KeyShot package I worked on. And there's like closed state, and then I can just drag that. It gives me the open state. So that way I don't have to constantly move a panel. And especially on this one where we had all these swatches inside, I would have had to move all those swatches or build two different models, where it's just easier doing that. I'll show you what I mean by the pivot points. So these are the pivot points. I build these into Solidworks, and then I'll just turn them off when I actually go to render. I'll just show you how I do the animation. So then that kind of folds out, and then you're in a. So come over here, copy that animation. So now I have this pivot point has moved. Now I'm going to move this lid next. Go to so now you have it in this 90 degree, but now I want to fold it even more open. So I'm just going to add in another animation. I'll pick that new pivot point down here. Oh. Pick the panel instead of the whole group. So I'm going to do that. There it goes. There it is. So there you go. So now let's kind of fold it open. One thing you don't want to do here is you don't want to set it to 90 like that, because it just looks fake. So it's always helpful if you have some packaging laying around the house just to see like how it actually looks. So you either want to, on this one, I think I want less than 90. So when you render it out, if you render it out like there, where it looks more natural, because the box is going to have some tension because of that wrap. So you leave it open a little bit like that, or I'd fold it. If it was a heavier box, I'd fold it past 90, so that way it's touching off on the ground. But I try to avoid having those flaps be a perfect 90 because it just looks fake. So I either go under or over. And then I do the same thing. Same thing for this panel. And then you can copy that animation and just I copied that and I pasted it on all those little swatches. So that way everything folds open. Then you just, when you're going to go render, just find those and turn them off, or even if you render, they're easy enough to Photoshop out. The next part of packaging I want to talk about is molded fiber trays. Molded pulp trays are paper fibers that are formed into like a 3D shape. There's different types of trays you can use depending on what you need the tray to do. There's a thick wall tray. This is usually like a rougher, it's like a rougher looking finish, and typically seen in like heavier industrial products such as a grill or think of anything heavy is usually using those. It's also more of like a finished looking tray, which are thinner and smoother, and those are commonly seen on like your iPhone usually has those, or speakers or cameras, like anything usually smaller, and you want a more finished appearance. And molded pulp is really all it really is just paper fibers, and they mix it into like a slurry with water, and then they'll press it into shape using like heat and pressure. And then for this KeyShot package, like this tray on the bottom that has a QR code, and this tray that held onto the solid state drive and the accessory box, those are both molded fiber. And that would be like your wet press trays, which I was talking about, like your thinner material, and that usually has like a more finished looking surface. And then usually on these, like one side is real smooth and the other side is pretty smooth, but it's usually a little bit rougher. So you want to make sure you have that smooth side facing the customer. The next program I want to talk about is ArtiosCAD. Artios is a packaging specific program that lets you create die lines. I use this for anything that I have to apply artwork to. In the program, you draw your die lines in 2D, and then it allows you to fold them up in 3D. I use this specifically when I need to hand die lines off to a graphic designer, or I'm going to cut samples on a table. This program is like a packaging heavy program. So it's when you're going to hand die lines off to a supplier or a vendor, this is really nice because you can export as a DXF and you can get like legitimate die lines that they can make tools off of. Some of the parts I'll make in this program include boxes, inserts, documents, master packs, sleeves, wraps, labels, stickers, any of that sort of stuff. Anything that really has to be die cut, I'll make in this program. Like this picture here on the right just shows the sleeve that we did for KeyShot. And this is just like what the die line looks like flat. This is the outside view, and then this is what the inside view. The inside view is just flood coated blue. And then this is just in KeyShot or in Artios, they have like a ton of pre-built die lines, you can kind of say, where they're you can kind of manipulate the dimensions and they'll give you out a package. So these are a bunch of just different packages that are on the program that I rendered out just to get an idea of what's available. You can make these pretty quick. Inside ArtiosCAD, I'm going to kind of explain some more stuff. When you go into Artios, you'll see there's like a ton of pre-built boxes to build from. Before you pick a box, it's good to understand what you need the box to do. Think about the unboxing experience, like how you want your customer to open up the box, and then what part of the product do you want the customer to see first? Like how do you get that? Like how are you going to build that wow factor in? So you want to make sure you control how the customer is going to unbox it as much as possible. So like for example, for items with a screen, you might have the opening on the top, so that way once they lift the top up, you have that screen right at their face. So that's like that wow factor you want. And then also for like heavy items, you might want to have like the lid come off, so that way the customer isn't lifting this heavy item out of the package. They're just lifting the package kind of off the product. So in essence, like all boxes aren't made the same, and it's important to pick a box that will best serve your customer. And another thing you want to think about is like on some materials, there's like a rougher edge, like the corrugation. You want to kind of hide that corrugation as much as possible, either by rolling over or having that facing away from the customer so you don't see it as much. It just makes your package look a little cleaner. And then within Artios, I'm going to talk about some of the materials. When you start to build your box, you'll see that there's like a ton of folding carton and corrugated boxes materials. So like folding cartons are your thinner material, and that's usually like your SBS and your CNC or CCN materials. And there's also corrugate, which is like a stronger, thicker material. It's like you think of your brown boxes a lot of times are made of corrugate. So like for folding carton, it's designated in a point system. So like, for example, 18 point SBS, each point is equal to 0.001 inch. So 18 point is 0.018 inches thick. You'll see folding cartons a lot, like you think of like a cereal box or cosmetics, a lot of times we use them. They're usually thinner. They don't have any of that corrugation material you see on them. And then for our corrugated box, that's made up of a corrugated material, which is designated by flute type. Corrugated material it has a sheet of paper, and then in between that, there's like a flute, which is that wavy part. And there's usually another sheet of paper glued to the bottom. And then there's also single wall, which is kind of what I just described. But then there's double wall, which is really, they just take 2 sheets of corrugate and they glue it together. Or you can do triple wall, which is 3 sheets glued together. For example, you could have BC corrugate, which would be a sheet of B flute and then a sheet of C flute, and you glue those 2 together. You would do that just to like add extra strength to your package. Then for corrugate, the thickness is designated by a letter. Like for example, like there's F flute, there's N flute. Those are like real thin. They look nicer materials. But then there's also like a B flute where it's a lot thicker. So those materials you'll use for like when you really need to protect your package, where you might use the F flute if you want your package to be strong, but it doesn't need to be as strong, or your product isn't as heavy and doesn't need that much protection. Then I'm going to show you guys how to build a die line in Artios real quick. So this is what I'm going to build. It's kind of like your regular box. I'm sure you've seen these a lot. You can build your die lines by scratch. You can also do this thing called run a standard. So you're going to come in here. It's going to give you options of like corrugated or folding carton. There's also other ones for like point of purchase displays. These don't have all the boxes, but there's a lot in here. And I find a lot of times is I'll build one and then I'll build off of that. So that way you can customize it. So for this one, we're going to do this box right here. And so come in here, it's going to ask you to pick your material. So we're going to come in here. We're going to do a corrugated material. Let's pick an E flute. And then it's going to ask you for the dimensions. We'll say, make sure I got this in metric. Yep. Okay, so we'll say 400 by 300 by 60. Then you hit the OK button. So there's your die line. So a lot of times, like this is where I'll start from. I'll use this, and then I'll build off of this, where we're either adding like a die cut into this, or we're adding the insert, the whole parts inside. But this kind of just gets you running. So from this point, you can take this 2D die line and you'll pass it off to your graphic designer, and they will add graphics to this, and then they'll usually send you those graphics back, or those die lines back. And then I'll also show you what you can do. This is for KeyShot. You want to do this is you can come into this 3D. We're just going to do a new 3D. So there's that box. And just right now it's flat. Then you can fold it up, which is really nice. So you can get a 3D model of your 2D die line. This is really helpful, especially working remote, as you can check the size. So then I'll build this package like this, and then I'll import it into Solidworks, and then I'll import the actual product model in there, and I can kind of build to make sure everything fits properly and looks kind of how I want it. So then you can fold all these flaps. And one thing I'll usually do is on this closure, it's at 90 degrees right now. Sometimes I'll put in like 90.5, 90.2, where it's just like popping up just a little bit, because I feel more realistic of how it's going to look in the real world. And then from here, you can export this. I used to always use these IGES and step versions because you can bring those right into SolidWorks. But if I'm going to render this, I'll use this VRL version. The reason I do this is it gives you this option where it says include corrugations, which the step in the IGES doesn't. So I'll show you what that does. So it's going to give you this material, which doesn't really look like much. And then here's our box. And then the only problem is you can't take that straight to KeyShot. I have to bring it into Cinema. But what it does is it gives you these, gives you this corrugation, which if you bring a step or an IGES file, that's just going to be just this brown material, and it's not going to be the correct corrugation. The really nice thing is that it's actually correct. It's like it matches what your dieline should be. So then you can take this, you'll export this as a Cineware. There it is. You can take that. And import that into KeyShot. Give it a second. There it goes. Maybe. Otherwise, if you don't do that, if you bring the step to IGES, you just have to kind of build a map like this and add it to it. Or what I used to do is I used to add a stack of corrugate, and I just took a photo of all the flutes on the side, and I would just put that onto that edge. But this is a lot faster doing it this way. Oh, must be reprocessing all these materials. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. But it does work. Just loading. So like from this point I was talking, you want to send a PDF or a DXF file of those dielines you created in Artios. You want to send those to your graphic designer or whatever team is working on your artwork. So at this point, it's really important that your art files, they have everything separated onto layers. So like, for example, on this one, if you have gloss, you would want everything that's gloss separated onto one layer, everything that's foil onto one layer. This is how your vendor usually wants the files. This is also makes my life a lot easier when I'm rendering, because when I render, I want to bring in like materials, or like I want to bring in everything that's foil together. I want to bring in everything that is matte finish together, so that way I can adjust those materials. I don't want them all as one. Otherwise, when you adjust the foil, it's going to adjust everything else. So like this is like the dieline I sent the KeyShot, and this is the artwork they sent back. It usually comes back in an Illustrator file with all the layers. And these are examples of what a dieline looks like, what you would send to your vendor. And this is an example like a drawing you would give to your vendor, which would have your blank size, which is these outside dimensions on top, or these larger dimensions on top. And then also you would usually include like an inside dimension, outside dimensions, and then your materials. See if, oh, there it is. So if you come in here, you can see it has this flute. The one is, I think this flute a lot of time is kind of weird looking. Oh, there it goes. So I'll come in here and I'll just adjust that. I'll just add a color adjust. Right now it's like really bright. I don't think it looks realistic. You just take a little saturation out and then make it darker. Most of the time is you're not zooming in that close anyway, so nobody notices it, but it makes a difference. Makes a difference trying to get that box to look realistic as having those flutes. And then also, if you have time, come back into your box, and you'd want to, like you see these flutes on the top of the box, you want to make sure those are all going in the correct direction based off of what these flutes are on the side. But I feel like most people never notice that you probably get away with not worrying about it. This is another view I like to do for renderings a lot, whereas I'll have a folded up box, but then I'll also render a flat box next to it. The reason I just do this is when you have a folded up box, it's hard to see. Like you can't see what's going on all the panels. For this one, you can see like on the sides we have a dot pattern, and on the front we have this graphic, and on the back we have this, where you kind of get a better idea of what's going on the entire package. And also makes it like a little more interesting of sometimes boxes are boring, where if you have a flat box, a folded box, different states of the box, it looks a little more visually intriguing. The next program I use is Cinema. This is one I just started using the last couple of years. I like this program because it's really fast. I find it's not as cumbersome as SolidWorks sometimes, but it's not as exact as SolidWorks sometimes. So I use this when I want to build my models fast, and I know I'm not going to send it to a vendor, or if I send a vendor, they're going to end up rebuilding it. This program is also really good for like inorganic shapes. So you think of like bags, fabrics, anything that's like weird, that's not a box, it's really good for. So for example, on this one, I did Shrinkwrap, which for me to render or model this in SolidWorks, I don't even know where I start. Where Cinema, this was really quick. I think I got really nice results out of it. Then I also just did the rope wrap and the book in there. And then for this one, I also did like this foil on top of a champagne bottle where you have that cork underneath it. There's usually those wires. So I wanted to have like the wire kind of in the foil where you get like that look of what a champagne bottle actually looks like. So I did that in Cinema where you kind of just draw around the bottle and those wires and it'll shrink around it. The same thing that'd be really hard to do in SolidWorks. The last program I use is Marvelous. Marvelous is really good at fabrics and bags. I had a really hard time doing that in SolidWorks. You could draw a bag, but it just didn't look real. Marvelous Designer is really like a fashion design program. You make clothing, you make bags in it. I'm just going to show you kind of how I build a bag. So I have like these, the idea was you have these documents on the right, on the left side, and then you would build a bag that go around it. It helps to bring in whatever product is going to go in the bag. So that way the bag can kind of form around the product. So I'm just moving the panels into place, and then you're going to essentially stitch them, but it's kind of just the same thing as you would do as heat sealing. And you just add physics, and then kind of just go around. You want to adjust your materials and adjust the physics options, so that way you don't have the product sticking through. You can kind of see it where I'm pulling on it just to get the bag on the outside of the product. And you can kind of, more you want to pull on it, you can add more wrinkles. You can adjust the materials to add more wrinkles. That bag was super quick, super easy. Yeah, so I really like this program, and I think it's really intuitive to learn. It's probably one of the easiest CAD programs I've used so far, as far as picking up and understanding how it works. This is a bag I did a Marvelous Designer where you have just product. I put the product inside the bag. It's very similar bag style as the one I just shown. You're just doing like a flap that goes over the top, and I just stitched this closed. And then this is also what you can do with it, is you can just drape fabric where it adds a little more interest to your renders. Or I just draped this fabric and then I used that pattern from the quick start guide for KeyShot. I used that pattern on the fabric, and then I just have like 2 hang tags you would see on clothing. From here, I just want to kind of talk about how I use KeyShot in my packaging. The way I kind of think about it is I build my KeyShot files like you would do a painting. I start out with like very little detail. I'll add material, like rough materials to everything. Same with the environment, I add rough environments. And then from there, I'll just kind of like build up. Or I'm not picking one part of the package or one part of the product and really narrowing that down. I just keep building up and bouncing around and building up until you get to a point where I think it looks good enough, or where I feel like I'm just adding stuff that people aren't going to notice or it doesn't really matter. For lighting, this is hard. and I think it helps if you have like a lot of reference pictures. So I created a folder on Pinterest that I'll just use where I'll have both renders and I'll have a lot of product photography and just regular photography where I understand like how a light's going to hit a screen and what happens, or how a light's going to hit a shape and what happens. It just gives you like good reference, and also it gives you some good ideas where like you see someone use a weird color and it like gives you some inspiration like build off of. And then I'm going to show you some more stuff on KeyShot. So like for KeyShot materials, this is just showing some of the materials we use for that box. Where I get some of these off the cloud. The cloud has really nice stuff. And you can also build your own. And then I also use Polygon a lot. They have really nice materials. I'm going to show you how I did this for the foil. This is something I've never done before, where I wanted the foil so that way, like when you look at kind of like those holographic packaging where like you turn the box and it looks a different color. So I'm just going to show you how I did that. Okay, so there's kind of what I was talking about where the foil looks green there, but then if I turn it this way, now it looks a little orange, then it looks blue. Depending on how the light hits it, it affects the color. So from here, I'm going to add just a base material. And for this, I'm going to use Polygon. Polygon has really nice packaging stuff. Let's come down to advanced. And I'm going to drag in. I use this plain paper 04. I don't want it to be brown, so I'm just going to leave that part out. But I'll take everything else out of this. So there's that, and then we'll start adding stuff. If you hit C, I don't know if people know it, but if you come on the map over here on your material graph, if you hit C, it'll show you what it looks like. So I'm going to make some adjustments. Like right now, it looks really rough. I don't want it to look that rough. So I'm going to come into this one. I want to adjust the brightness on this, my reflection. Yep. And for our gloss, I'm going to adjust this also. Color adjust the value. So I want to invert this value. We'll change that to 0.1. I was looking too rough. I'll turn on normal map. Turn it down. And then I also added in a second bump. I said a bump add. The second bump material I added was just this light scratches. These are also from Polygon, which kind of looks like. I just do these real light because you figure your paper's going to have a little bit of scratch to it, a little bit of use. That's way too much. So I'll come in. Same thing and adjust that. You can barely see it. And then from here, I'll start adding in the graphics. So this is what I like to do first is I take the graphics that I received from KeyShot and I'll apply everything. I kind of use this just as a map. I have the dieline included. You can't see it. There's white text over here and there's white text down here, but you'll see it once I add it to the box. So I'm just going to move this. So I'll come in here. Yep, as long as you want to export, make sure you export it at 300. And then when you import it, it should be the same scale. So you shouldn't have to affect the scale. So then I see this dieline right here. I want to line that up at the top to understand where that goes. And there should be, you see that red line? Yep, you can kind of see it there on the right side. So that's going to be this right edge. So now I have that lined up. And I'm just using this as kind of like a map on where to place the rest of the stuff. Right now, everything is the same material. You can see like this foil is the same as this KeyShot text, which I don't want. I want those parts to be separate. So in Illustrator, I separated out this KeyShot logo. I'll bring that in. I'm going to add that as a metal. It's not our whole box turned metal, but we'll fix that in a second. I'm going to add that as an opacity map. Then I want to add this as I want to mask out some of that, so I'm going to do this color composite source, and then down to clipping mask. That's the oh, I know I got to go back in here. There you go. Inverse that. So now you have this. I want to make sure it's repeating. Turn that off. Change this to 300 so it matches everything else. You want to just move this, kind of get it. Like that. And then I'm going to add in that foil gradient next. So in order to do that, you're going to use right click, textures, color gradient, drag that into the color. You want to select this one as view direction. I'm going to turn off our map. And then for this, I had this gradient that KeyShot had sent me that they liked. So I kind of went in there, I dropped colors. I'll show you how to do that. Or pick the first one. I have these written down, help me out. 0. And just add another one. Kind of just building your gradients. I did this originally, I dropped over, but I have the colors written down. And I'll do one more. This one is last one. There you go. Kind of gets your foil. Then also I'll add a little bit of roughness to this, so it doesn't look as perfect. It kind of doesn't look realistic right now. But doing it this way, then I would add in, I can turn this back on our map. So then I have this KeyShot logo right on there. And I have that as a separate material. I'll bring that in. This way I can have complete control over this part and that part and keep them separate. Then I kind of do the same for the side graphics, same with top and side. Some of the other things I want to show you in KeyShot, I think I use a lot, I think are helpful, is model sets. I don't know if a lot of people know what they are. They're really useful. So you can see I have tons of them down here where it's just show you how to add one. So you have all your product there. I have the ground on a separate model set. So say we wanted just the sleeve by itself. You could turn everything off, or you just come in here, create a new model set from selection. You have just the sleeve selected, type in sleeve. There it goes. So now you have just this one part. I can move this part all around. And if I go back to, I'll move this just to show you. So if I go back to that original default one, it hasn't moved. So that way, when you're doing shots like this one, or these ones we had all these little swatches all over the place. It was kind of nice to have different model sets. That way, I wasn't taking it off of this. You have like that original. What I'll do is I'll bring in that original file, and then I will start pulling parts off of that and moving stuff around after I added all the materials, and I'm kind of at the final stage. And then one last thing that I just found recently that I thought was really useful is if you come in, when you go into render, if you come in this custom, you can customize, or you can change what your file names are going to be, and it'll automatically set up. So you can set up your environments, you can add ones. So it's kind of nice if you're looking back on it, you don't know what model set this image is from, it'll automatically add it where this is a Doge apartment environment, scene 1. So when I'm looking back at my file name, I know exactly what it was. Okay. And finally, these are some of the things, some packaging or KeyShot tips. Like I said, try to avoid having 90, 0, 180, 360, like on your opening flaps. Just doesn't look natural. And then other things to avoid is you can have a shot that has everything in focus, but don't make every slide in your presentation everything in focus and showing everything. Like you don't, when you highlight everything, you're kind of highlighting nothing. So it's kind of nice just to like have each slide focus on one area and show off that area. And then for this, I get a lot of questions on how you do UV. It helps on the material, you just make smooth, but then it all comes down to lighting. When you do your lighting, you want to make sure you have that pin kind of bisecting where the UV is going to be, so that way you have a dark and a light side. Or if that pin doesn't bisect it, it's just everything looks light and it just looks like it's a lighter color print and not a UV finish. That's kind of how I did this also. That's about it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. That was great. Really appreciate the insight to the world of packaging there. I did want to highlight the project, the KeyShot packaging project that he's been showing you guys. Matt did that project for us. We have it up on our website at keyshot.com/packaging. If you guys want to kind of take a look at all the different assets he generated and his process there, it gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going on with the project. We should have some assets for download up there too soon. So if you guys want to play around and kind of dive into that, that would be great. And again, thanks to everyone who made it. Really appreciate you guys all being part of today's webinar. At this point, I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. I'll try to pull some pertinent questions out of what's already been asked, but feel free to ask some more if you guys have them, and we'll do our best to answer them. I'm going to kind of just dive in here. There was a few questions related to SolidWorks sheet metal for making cardboard boxes. What are your thoughts on that, Matt? Have you ever played around with that, or what's the reasoning behind using another program over doing it that way?
I used it a long time ago, so I haven't touched it in a while. You can do it in there. It's just a little more tedious because it's not like a program built for building boxes necessarily, where Artios is specifically built for building boxes. So if you can use Artios, I would use Artios. It's gonna be a lot faster, but you can do it on SolidWorks. Just a little more time consuming.
Sweet. That's a good thing to know. We also had a question related to folded angles and animations when you're working in Artios. Do you typically have issues importing those into KeyShot, or have you imported those, or do you prefer to work in KeyShot after importing to create those folds?
I don't know if you can actually, I have to look into that, if you can actually export Artios animations into KeyShot. But what I'll usually do is when I build my Artios files is when I export it, I'll export like a closed box, an open box, a flat box. I'll export all the different states I want in, but then I wouldn't necessarily animate it in KeyShot. If you're going to animate the box, you might have to build it in different programs. Because a lot of times when you export out of Artios, it'll export like hundreds of faces. So it'll just make it a little difficult.
Makes sense. We had also a few questions come in about your cardboard and your cardstock materials. Do you have any tips for creating more realistic cardboard materials or cardstock materials, or where you source those, and how you go about creating them if you don't?
A lot of them I get from Polygon, like I was saying. Polygon, you can also use, like, sometimes I'll use that plastic material that's on KeyShot, and I'll just start modifying that. I'll add in like some noise. And if you're doing like a fine folding carton, it's going to look kind of similar. As far as like corrugate, I think Polygon does a really good job. Or sometimes I'll take photos and I'll use like reference where I'll add wrinkles into it, either in Photoshop or into KeyShot. I'll use a bump map and I'll add in those wrinkles.
Sweet. And then what about ESCO Studio? I know ESCO has been used in the past for packaging. Is there a reason why you don't use ESCO, or have you had experience using ESCO? We had a question about that as well.
I have not used ESCO Studio. I used the SolidWorks Studio, I think, before. They had like a rendering program before KeyShot, and then I just jumped into KeyShot.
Cool. We also had a question about, and I believe they're referencing that Peloton rendering you did where you had the flat packaging, but they were asking about the creases you had on your flat pack. Yeah. Yeah, that one right there. Yeah, they were asking about how you kind of approach creating those creases in there. Are you modeling them? Are you using bump maps or displacement? How do you go about doing that?
That's actually modeled, because when you do it in ArtiosCAD, it'll give you those creases.
Makes it look a lot more realistic, I think.
Yeah. If you don't do that, sometimes I'll just do them in Photoshop afterwards. You can use like the 3D like emboss tool, where it doesn't look as good as this though. But like up close shots, it's really nice to have Artios to do that sort of stuff.
That makes sense. Yeah, that looks very realistic. And then we also had some questions related to lighting. I was curious if you could kind of talk on how you like to light your scenes, or maybe even go into that KeyShot packaging scene you built and give everybody an idea of how you kind of approached lighting that one.
Sure. I can just open up the KeyShot. Like I said, a lot of times I'll try to find reference images and then kind of try to figure out what they did, where they would have lights to make sense. A lot of times I'll use like these HDRIs, and then I usually will add a pin. Yeah, so I'll come in here and I'll just add pins based off of like where I need it to be brighter, where I need a hard reflection coming down on it. And I'll find it helps if you turn up the contrast and then turn down the brightness on most of these. If I have time, I'll build one from scratch. But it's usually I almost always start out like an HDRI or one of the studios, and then just you can come in this HDRI editor and you can add pins.
Are you pulling your HDRIs from outside of KeyShot or the cloud library, or do you typically just use the ones that are already in the environment library?
I usually use the ones that are in the environment library or the cloud, or I think I have a couple from Polygon, but I'd say the vast majority of them are out of KeyShots. Like the stock ones are out of the cloud, and then I just come into here and I add pins to manipulate them.
Very cool. Yeah, and just a side note for everybody else, that cloud library, if you guys aren't utilizing it, great resource. I mean, there's environments, there's models. If you want to practice scenes, there's all kinds of materials that other users are generating. And you can just hop on there even if you don't have a cloud library account and start downloading. So it's a great little extension of the existing library inside KeyShot.
Yeah, there's tons of them in there. I feel like you can. A lot of times, and also what I'll do a lot of times, I'll just start dragging stuff on and kind of just see like if anything's popping. Like if something a shadow looks really good or reflection looks really good, like then I'll start working off of that. What happens if I add a pin here? What happens if I increase the contrast? What happens, or if I add in color? Or other things you'll do is come into these backgrounds. You can adjust saturation just to try to match your feeling. And then I also do I'll do a lot in Photoshop too at the end, just to adjust colors.
Very cool. Yeah. And then I know we had a conversation at one point and we were discussing lighting, and you just recently kind of started playing a little bit more with physical lighting instead. I mean, in general, I know physical lighting is going to be a lot more demanding on your computer when you're working than with HDRIs and pins. Is that a reason why you choose to do HDRIs over physical lighting, or do you have another reason?
No, that's a huge reason, because it slows everything down, especially like when you have big files. It's kind of nice to do it this way. And then a lot of times, if you have physical lighting, it's really good. Physical lighting is really great if you only have like one static shot. When you're doing like tons of different shots, you kind of have to keep moving that light to kind of get the right look every time. Or I feel like an HDRI kind of covers a lot more.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that's actually a nice little tip for anybody who's kind of working remote right now, or you guys are on underpowered workstations for any reason. You know, HDRIs are a lot less energy intensive and data intensive when you're building your scene. So you're going to be able to move a lot quicker. Cool. I'm looking through these questions. I think we covered a large majority of them. So I really appreciate you kind of jumping in there on the fly and grabbing them. I think it's about time to wrap things up. Just a reminder that we're going to be posting this webinar as well as the demos broken out into separate videos on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to jump over there if you're looking for some more content. And I also don't forget, I'll be linking Matt's Instagram in the description. You can find him at Bucktail Design by following that link if you can't find him on Instagram. And thank you, Matt. It was awesome having you here today. Do you have any last words or parting thoughts for everybody?
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you guys for all your help. And if you guys anyone out there has any questions or problems, my email is at the end, or you can hit me on Instagram and I'll try to help you out.